Today I want to ask the question, is it okay for Americans to be somewhat racist against Asian Americans? So a long time ago, back in my university days, I went to kind of an above average university. And as such, as is common with many above average universities in America, there's an overrepresentation of Asian Americans in those universities. Now, the population in America of Asian Americans is about 6% of our overall population. And yet at my university in 2016, the amount of Asian Americans was about 46%, something like 7, almost 8 times what the national average was in the population. And people kind of start to wonder, well, how is it that Asian Americans are so overrepresented in good universities? And once again, at my university, 2% of our student body was African American, despite the fact that in the general population, 14% is African American. And even for white people, my university was about 20% Caucasian, whereas the general population of America is something like, I think it's somewhere between 55 and 60% white. So the question is always, how is this happening? And there's usually explanations about structural racism, like for African Americans, their great-great-grandparents were slaves, and even their grandparents were living under Jim Crow laws. Like very recently, black people were being openly discriminated against, and that, of course, is still having ramifications to this day. But it's a very contentious issue, and it's hard to know where to draw the line, and I've always been kind of, the movement is called affirmative action, where you kind of try to make sure that the same percentage of people in the population will be represented at a university. And UCSD, where I went to school, was doing it for a long time, and then it got banned, and they got rid of it, and it's a long story, but I've always been kind of on the fence about affirmative action because I do believe in structural racism. But at the same time, I'm not sure if you should cure racism with racism. But anyway, this week, Harvard is having their own problem with kind of affirmative action, which is they're being sued, and it's going to the Supreme Court, and they're being sued because what's being charged or alleged is that they have these certain criteria for whether or not they let a student in. And one of these criteria is something like personality or personhood or something very vague like that. And Asian American people who are applying for Harvard have been on average rated lower than non-Asian American people. And it looks like they're using this very vague criteria to kind of keep their Asian American population low at their university. And look, affirmative action is racist. I mean, you're treating people differently based on their skin color. And the argument for it is basically, well, yes, but in the end we'll have more fairness, because if we're racist in a smaller way, in the end we'll have a better representation of people everywhere. And so when you see a lawyer or a doctor, he won't always be Asian, so that people growing up will see non-Asian doctors and they'll think, well, I'm not Asian and I can also be a doctor. And it's a very complicated subject matter, but basically there's kind of an argument for affirmative action which says if we're a little racist now, in the future our society overall will be less racist. Now, I know it sounds absurd if you've never heard it, but there are some good arguments for and against affirmative action, which I'm not going to go into now, but what it really boils down to is luck. Now, we all know in any society, if you want a fair society, you want luck to be minimized. You can't get rid of it, of course, but you want it to be minimized. And one of the things that could be lucky or not is your skin color, especially in America. One of the things that could be lucky or not is, just genetically how smart you are. And those two things are kind of actually hard to gauge how much luck you get based on your skin color, or how much luck you got from genetics, from being smart. But the thing that's very clear that's about luck is, were you born rich or not? Because if someone's born rich, they can work just as hard as someone who's born poor and have a much better outcome, especially when we talk about education-wise. Like if you're born really poor, you might not have your own room to study in. You definitely won't have enough money for SAT prep courses. You certainly won't have enough money for tutoring, the kind of things that the rich student will have. So they'll both work equally hard, and one will have a drastically better outcome. And we all know that is unfair. And it's not like we can shovel money down to poor people, because that would also be kind of, in a way, unfair and have all these other problems. But we do know, at least when it comes to going to university, because in America university is so expensive, there's some idea that poor kids should get scholarships. Poor kids should have lower tuition. They've worked probably harder than a rich kid because they had to fight a lot of adversity. So We don't want them to go further into debt, and we want them to be able to at least attend the same institutions if they get in. So we have these ways of making things fair. And I think most people can agree that that's probably a good idea. When it comes down to race, things get a little weird. And traditionally, the race that gets the most benefits is white people. White people, the real benefit I think we have is that nobody assumes anything about us. And there's been a bunch of studies about structural racism where a black defendant will get a heavier, more harsher punishment from a jury than a white defendant. And the most interesting thing is even a black jury will give a harsher punishment sentence to a black defendant than they will a white defendant. So there is structural racism, and there is some advantage to being white. But now what's getting really weird is that we're seeing a new ethnicity that is doing well. And now it's Asian people, Asian Americans. And it's kind of throw this all into whack. And I don't know if you're for affirmative action or against affirmative action, but it seems to be that Asian people are doing much better educationally, especially at the college level, than other ethnicities and other minorities. And the way that most people explain this is a lot of Asian Americans are second generation. I don't know if you call them first generation, but their parents are immigrants from Asia. Asia has a culture that impresses upon people that you should study a lot. Like if you're Korean watching this, and you probably are Korean, you know that Korea has the culture, the society has this incredible emphasis on education. Now, people would argue, people who are for affirmative action, who are for this kind of thing that Harvard was doing, say that, look, these guys are lucky that they have parents who come from a culture that stress education. Because if you come from a culture that stresses education, then you're more likely to go to a good university. And that's kind of an unfair advantage. But in my heart, the reason I'm not so happy about it is that you could be a third generation Asian person in America, and you're no longer getting that cultural stress to work super hard, and yet you worked super hard. It wasn't that easy. So to me, it's not as clear cut as money. Money is very clear cut. You could see the income of a family and go, look, they were poor, they should get some help. It's a lot harder to see the cultural advantage you might have by having parents who recently came from Korea or China or Japan or wherever, and to measure that and see how much society should do to make it fair. So my question to you is, do you think it's okay for Harvard to be taking these actions, or for anyone to take these actions that are essentially racist against Asian Americans? So if you like my video, give it a thumbs up. If you hate my video, give it a thumbs down. If you love me or hate me, hit the subscribe button. This video is definitely kind of controversial, so I really want to hear from you. You can leave comments, of course, or you can go to my website. The link is in the description down below. It's parkgayday.com. You can go there, sign up for my newsletter, join my chat room, have a discussion with us about these topics, because I know the people in there will definitely talk about this once the video comes out, and I'll be in there too. You can talk to me. And of course, the number one most important thing of all, have a super awesome day.
창화 그리고 김유리 덕분에 저는 이런 영상을 만들 수 있습니다. 여러분의 지원 덕분에 이번 영상을 제작할 수 있었습니다.